Hey folks, Michael Anthony here with the Exceptional Life Podcast. Thank you for joining me on another episode. I have a very special episode for you today. Our first guest interview of 2021. His name is James Connelly, and he is the producer of Sacred Cow, a new documentary that just got released yesterday on iTunes and Amazon Prime and several other platforms across the globe. It's a phenomenal documentary that I had the chance to get an early viewing of back just a few months ago. And I'll tell you what, it is full of tremendous insight as it relates to diet, health, agriculture, sustainability, and several other topics that are really all interconnected, right? The health of our bodies as humans, the health of our planet, and kind of the whole ecosystem of plants and animals and how we all kind of function together as a whole, and how that's been broken and where it's headed, and how there are solutions for better health, for a better world, for a sustainable world, and a way to feed a tremendously huge population of people. So James is a producer, an artist, a chef, and just a tremendous individual overall. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I hope you stick around. If you feel that that meat is bad for your health, if saturated fat and cholesterol are bad for your health, or that cattle and beef production is bad for the environment, as far as climate change and sustainability goes, then I think you need to definitely check out the documentary Sacred Cow. There's also a supplemental book that's available. You can get it on Amazon. Has all the science and research. And I'll tell you what, everything that's talked about in this documentary is backed up by very solid science and research. And so if you care about your health, if you care about your family's health and the health of the population of the planet and about the future generations to come, then you need to check out this documentary, check out the book, listen to this podcast, and I hope you enjoy the show. All right. Hello, folks. Michael Anthony here with the Exceptional Life Podcast, and excited to be bringing you another episode. I have a very special guest with me here today. And in fact, he's our first guest of 2021. So happy New Year to everybody out there. Our guest, his name is James Connelly, and he is the producer of a film called Sacred Cow, a documentary that I'm really thrilled about. And I had the privilege of getting an early viewing of it just a few months ago, and I started sharing it right away. There's so many important topics that are included in this documentary, everything from health, agricultural, beef and cattle, meat, and sustainability. So there's a whole spectrum of topics within this documentary that I suggest everybody take a look at. And so without further ado, James Connelly, how are you today? Thanks for joining us.
I'm good. Thank you so much for inviting me on. I'm doing okay. Awesome. So
I understand Sacred Cow was kind of officially released, what was it, yesterday, right? On iTunes, Amazon, kind of all those platforms. Is that correct?
Yeah. Dinah had wanted to, she had done a couple of, in and around Thanksgiving, she had done a limited release. And, obviously this year has been hellish for getting into festival circuits and all of that stuff. So, everything's essentially gone virtual. And I think in many ways I don't think anybody's really going to film festivals virtually. Yeah. I think it's particularly hard. We had originally had somewhere around like maybe 13 countries that we were going to premiere at. We were invited to Kenya, Australia, Belgium, the UK. We wanted to show it to an audience that had been sort of raised on a lot of food documentaries that are very specific to, the sort of vegan worldview, highly subsidized, highly profitable documentaries that we thought was giving a very skewed version of animal agriculture.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, and I mean, it's such a powerful documentary. So I think you guys did a phenomenal job with that. And I mean, after I watched it right around Thanksgiving is when I had an opportunity to view it, and I immediately was sharing it with people, social media, emailing it. I bought several copies of the book, which I
Cool.
suggest everybody check this out. I gifted it to people. I mean, it's something that I've been passionate about, especially from a health and diet perspective, because of my transformation I've had in health, and in especially taking on a meat heavy diet. And I'm also an avid outdoorsman. I'm a hunter, I'm a fisherman. And so it all kind of brings it together. And so the film, I think, was phenomenal. And also the part of it that they touch on with climate change and sustainability. And there's so much misinformation around that. And so we could obviously talk hours about all the different topics and how they're all interrelated in this documentary. So I think it's powerful, and I'm going to do what I can to promote it and get the message out there. But I thought it was in some ways it was stunning, the breadth of interviews that Diana was able to sort of wrangle, using her platform. And, we had a limited amount of time. You have, say, 90 minutes to make a point in a film. And, I think and I don't want to necessarily say this is an anti-vegan film in any way, but if you have a documentary about sports culture and diet, then you have the Game Changers documentary. If you have something about health, then you have What the Health. If you have climate change, then you have Cowspiracy. And so you have these multiple stratagems that have been used. There are 2 documentaries that are in post-production now. One talking about zoonotic disease that they're fast tracking because of COVID. And then another one that talks about social justice issues associated with the Black community, made by a Black vegan. And, I think that one of the things I found particularly disturbing about it is when you have a single issue subject, like, you've everything leads back to animal agriculture. And I think that's a lot of the activism that's coming out now. It's like, they're trying to touch upon people's fear of, lifestyle disease, their fear of obesity, their fear of all of these things. And what it's done is it's really obfuscated the role that the ultra processed food industry has done to manipulate the way that we eat food. And you can see the rise of the obesity epidemic contingent with, the dietary guidelines, 1978, you start to sort of push people towards a, grain-based diet. And, for the most part, I think people did adhere to that. They tried to stay low fat. They tried to use vegetable oils. They did all of these things because of dietary recommendations. And me, as a former veteran, I saw the food system functionally change when I was, 18 years old. When we wanted rapid weight loss in basic training, it was eggs and bacon and all of that stuff. These sort of low calorie diets, but really nutrient dense, because you're waking up at like 4 o'clock in the morning and, going through basic training and, intense exercise and psychological manipulation and sleep deprivation and all of that stuff. And now, we've outsourced all of that stuff to the same companies that are feeding our children, the same companies that are feeding our school to prison pipeline, and all this other stuff. And it's all this ultra processed food, multiple ingredients, things that are designed to be hyper palatable, so that you shut off. One of the problems that the food industry has had for years, is that we don't grow a population fast enough for them to make quarterly and yearly profits. And so what they have to do is get you to eat more. And so these food scientists have really gotten together and created a perfect mix, perfect storm of sugar, fat, and salt, so that you just, I'll eat an entire package of Oreos. I can't have them in the house. Right? Absolutely.
The body doesn't recognize it as food. It just recognizes it as a reward sensation. And I've watched what was the original vegan activism movement move from that to really supporting these multinational corporations who have created these, what I like to call, animal feed for humans. And so they've taken these really low nutrient foods, They've, added a bit of sparkle to them, and, lo and behold, they look like meat, and they taste like meat, and they bleed like meat. But for the most part, they're just not. They're just, a fake substitute.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a good point, because these multi-billion-dollar corporations, they employ food scientists and psychiatrists and all sorts of different professionals to develop the addictive quality of foods and how they taste and how they make you feel. And it's no wonder that we have such issues with obesity and diabetes and different autoimmune conditions. But the messaging is also so powerful that they're able to put out there the propaganda to kind of keep people in that, almost like that blue pill, right? Like you get red pilled and you understand all this stuff, but it's like everything's so skewed and nobody knows what the truth is. They don't know why they're sick. They, think the opposite is true. It's disturbing in a sense. So
yeah, and the worst part about it for me has always been that you blame the consumer at the end of it.
Yeah.
And when I ran a nonprofit for close to a decade in New York City, and we worked in inner city schools doing nutrition education. And, so it was contingent with Michelle Obama's Let's Move program. And, you saw Michael Pollan had written an op-ed the same day that the Farm Bill was signed by President Obama. Michelle Obama was launching her program, with all of these processed food makers standing behind her, essentially signing this constitution that said that they will try to limit the amount of exposure that they're doing to children, and the limit the salt intake, all those things that they don't really don't have a tremendous amount of effect on health. And so the whole calories in, calories out perspective of this, it's been marketed to us for a real long time. It's like Americans are lazy. They don't want to move. They move too little. And so they're just not burning the calories that they would need. And so everything becomes a treat. And then you blame the person who starts to, have weight problems, and, you can blame it on whatever you want to blame it on, but you could say that, Americans drink too much, but look, we have children with type 2 diabetes. What used to be called adult onset diabetes is now called type 2 because we have children who are dealing with that. And, I just think it's like, because we can really obscure all of the harm that these ultra processed food companies have done for a very long time, then we get into these wars over whether or not you should eat meat or shouldn't eat meat, and whether or not it's healthy. Is it a carcinogen? All of these things are associated with, like, all right, if I go and I buy a hot dog with a bun with ketchup that's laden with sugar, also have it with a Coke and some fries, really we're going to blame the hot dog for all of that stuff?
Yeah, it's crazy. It really is. I mean, I think back, a decade ago, and I would have thought the same thing. I know there was a point in time where I was really conflicted, because I am an outdoorsman. I'm a hunter, and I harvest deer and turkey and duck every year. And there was a point in time where my health was failing miserably, and I really felt terrible. And I had this thought, like, well, should I be eating more vegetables? Should I not be eating meat? I'm an outdoorsman. Like, should I not be hunting? Like, I had all these thoughts going on in my head, and it was disturbing to me. That's when I really started to dive in, looking at research and talking to different doctors and professionals in nutrition. And I really started to, uncover layers of misinformation, and getting through, the guidelines and stuff that just didn't make sense, and came out on top, afterwards. And then I realized that, what I'm doing as a hunter is good for the environment. It's good for my health, my family's health. And I even think of it as a very spiritual experience, and it feels like a very spiritual experience, including more meat and less vegetables. And I still eat vegetables. I'm not, saying vegetables are bad, but I do eat, a lot more meat, and I'm so much more healthier for it. And I'm 40 years old, and I feel and look better than I ever did at 30. So, Yeah, it's there's a lot of disturbing misinformation out there, and a lot of my friends and family who've even come to me and been like, what are you doing? And some of them were vegans and vegetarians, and some of them still are, but the ones
Mm.
kind of taken that leap and and tried something different and thought for themselves and understood uh, how beneficial meat can be, and started to understand nutrition and how it affects your biology. I've even my father, he was type 2 diabetic, got off all
Mm.
his medication, lost over 40 pounds. He's thriving. He's in his 60s. He looks great. He feels great, and that's not the first time I've seen it. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
U.S. News and World Report just came out with their, I don't know, what are they? It's 41 diets. And it's so funny because I think if you actually, their number one versus their, number 41, I think if you switch that, you might actually get healthy. So keto and paleo and all of them are, specifically always, they're always put up as one of the worst diets, primarily because of the fact that it's difficult to adhere to. If you're traveling a lot, if you're in airports, it's like, what do you eat?
Yeah.
I've never found it particularly difficult. I've been 15 years paleo.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm traveling and there's nothing to eat, I don't eat.
Yeah.
And
Fasting.
yeah,
Yep.
and it's just I'm not particularly hungry, especially on those flights. It's you know, um, I'm not, I'm not 18, 20-hour flights and stuff like that. It's like our hunter-gatherer past that went through large periods of time without eating,
Yeah.
and I think the thing that I find particularly difficult about that is because they'll also give the vegan diet a plus. And how restrictive is the vegan diet? It cuts out entire food groups.
Mm-hmm.
And not only that, you also have to look into, say you go to a restaurant, you have to say, I'm vegan. These are the things that I can't allow to have on there. Chicken stock and any number of different things. How limiting is that? And it's still given better performance than the paleo diet.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
crazy. It's become so political and money driven. I mean, it just amazes me. And there's one doctor, Dr. Daniel Pompa, he calls it the 180 effect. So anything you hear from the news or these government guidelines, just do the opposite of that, or even a traditionally trained doctor who's still parroting information from 50 years ago that's largely inaccurate. He says just do the 180 effect. Whatever they tell you to do the opposite of, which is kind of sad. Like, you got to look at it that way, but it's true.
Yeah. But I remember taking the bow hunting course up in Connecticut, their bow hunting certification course. And, such a huge percentage of that was about conservation.
Yeah.
And it was understanding. So up in Connecticut, you wouldn't see deer 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Their population has absolutely exploded. And in so many different ways, mainly because there's no predators around anymore.
Yeah.
And what they do to young growth forests is devastating.
Mm-hmm.
And so, most of that course was about the benefits and conservation that happens with that. And then, when you also deal with overpopulation with prey species, regardless of whether or not it's rabbits or deer or anything like that. Well, what happens without prey around is you get these massive explosions, and then you have starvation. And so, culling those species, using it and feeding your family and feeding people is just such an integral part of, the sort of conservation movement. And you don't have to convince hunters of that.
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, it totally makes sense for sure. And, I try to take young people, even older people I've introduced to hunting that had never hunted before, older than myself in their 50s and 60s. And it's always been a very fulfilling, wonderful experience. I mean, I've turned non-hunters into hunters, and even people who are vegan, vegetarians, eating meat and hunting. And if you actually get to experience that, it is a very fulfilling experience. And so that leads me to another topic, is just how disconnected people are from nature, right? And I know the film touches on that in the book. It's like people are totally alienated from the outdoors, and if people had grown up around that, then maybe spent a little more time understanding it and kind of that whole cycle of life and how things work out there in nature, then maybe we wouldn't have so many different conflicting views today.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, in many ways, the American vegetarian movement started when people left the farm and started to move into cities. You started to see a real disconnect between where their food was coming from. And so you get people like Sylvester Graham, the inventor of graham crackers, graham flour specifically, but eventually became graham crackers. You started to see this whole sort of movement towards away from eating meat. It had a religious connotation to it. It had notions of purity, right? So why would you, this sort of the removal of the animalistic nature that is the human being, can we remove those things, in total, and become something like, not necessarily more godlike, but more pure and closer to God. And you start to see that really sort of personified in John Harvey Kellogg, right? So Kellogg's cornflakes, you see a guy who abstained from meat. He abstained from sex, abstained. He wrote his treatise on anti-masterbation on his honeymoon. He claimed he never had sex with his wife in his entire life. And he did this, he started this whole movement around vegetarianism. And it's sort of interesting because I think that area in Battle Creek, Michigan is essentially where all the cereals that we have, most of them come from there. And it was a huge religious movement that sought purity by abstention from meat. I think that level of morality today is what you start to see in a lot of the sort of vegan movement as well. They call themselves more ethical than meat eaters. They've invented a word called carnism. It's like, right? It's saying that we are we don't understand the cycles of nature because we're so inundated with the idea that we should be eating meat, And I think it's funny because I think if you study enough hunter-gatherers, they would laugh at any notion that you shouldn't eat meat.
Yeah. Right? Oh man, I could imagine the looks on their faces, right? Like a hunter-gatherer tribe that's been disconnected from modern day society to suggest that they don't hunt or eat meat would be, it'd be a perplexed look on their face, right? Just as perplexing as if you asked a coyote not to eat a deer, right? I mean, it's really the same concept, right?
Yeah. And, I think you start to see that in the movement to feed dogs vegan food and feed cats vegan food. And, they're quite literally trying to take carnivores and make them into vegetarians or herbivores. Yeah. And I think that I don't want to in any way denigrate the activism that veganism has really pushed. I think most of the footage that we see of confined animal feeding operations and all of those things are pretty horrific. Does it also mean that most of the farmers who are raising animals are doing that? I think it's hard to get a sense of how much we've incentivized people to move towards large CAFOs. We've had most of our governmental programs do not give even reasonable subsidies to people who are involved in regenerative agriculture, who raise their animals on pasture, who adhere to welfare standards. You can get a loan, though, if you want to, have a barn that's going to house 50,000 chickens. Yeah. Once you sign up with that contract with Tyson, once you've essentially set yourself up for penury, for sharecropping, for that. Because you have to buy the chicks, you have to buy the feed, you have to buy all of the, antibiotics, take all the risk yourself, and then you have to sell it back to Tyson once it's done, for pennies, quite literally pennies. And so we've essentially taken these farmers who are multi-generational farmers and put them into debt where they're, it's sort of like the Walmart effect of things, right? And so there is a growing movement of people who say, no more, we're done with this. I think if you look at the late 90s, say close to 90% of pig farming was small family owned operations. And now it's a complete 180. It's about 10% are that. The rest are essentially just these massive feeding operations, and it's, yeah, go ahead.
No, that's absolutely. And that's a great transition, because a large part of the film and a lot of what this message is about is changing the way we do things, right? The agricultural, the food production. And I love that saying, it's not the cow, it's how, right? Because a lot of people do have that belief that beef cattle are terrible for the environment, that, they're farting methane and it's destroying the climate, right? And so that message is pushed all the time out there. There's tons of propaganda on that. And there's a point in time where I thought that was true as well. And one other thing I might add too is I worked at one point for a couple of years. I was working for a sustainability software company, and we provided sustainability reporting software to huge corporations, Fortune 500 companies, to report on their greenhouse gas emissions to the CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project. And it was interesting because I didn't know much about sustainability, and so when I came in, I learned a lot. And we had climate scientists that worked for us, and the founder was a Nobel laureate climate scientist. But interestingly enough, you didn't hear a lot about the whole cattle message that's out there to the public and all the propaganda around that. A lot of the companies we focused on are ones that are actually doing damage to the climate, right? There's industry, fashion, clothing production, huge greenhouse gas emitters, single-use plastic container production, right? All the pollution going into our ocean. Like we focused on organizations that are causing that. And so it was funny because you never heard the climate scientist in that company talking about beef cattle, but that's being, put out there in the public. You hear it on the news and the media that, the cows farting methane is causing a massive change in the climate. So, what's your thoughts on that?
I think a lot of it came about because of the frenzy, the IPCC report and the accords that were put together, because you had companies and countries trying to reach some degree of net neutrality in terms of carbon emissions over a finite period of time, about less than a decade now, to do that. And so what you get is a lot of bean counters who say, all right, well, what are the quickest, most efficient ways that we can start to cut emissions? And, then you'll start to look at those things. And, I think we're all addicted to the technologies that we have nowadays. And so energy and transportation and, fossil fuels, all of those things are in many, many, many leagues above animal agriculture and agriculture in general in terms of emission sources. But nobody wants to give up on any of that, right? We're moving towards the technological future. And, unless, how are we going to build the Starship Enterprise if we don't continue along this way? And so they were looking for what we, the reason why we call it sacred cow is we're scapegoating cows. Yeah. And, the original concept of the scapegoat was, in Middle Eastern religions and in the Jewish religion, you would heap all of your sins upon this goat and then send it off into the desert to die. And, in many ways, that's what cows have had to deal with. As far as methane sources are concerned, there's a lot of debate over the numbers. Methane is a big source of greenhouse gas emissions, but biogenic methane from cattle is only in the atmosphere for about a decade, and it converts into water vapor and carbon. And so when you can see the cycle actually makes a lot of sense. The grass is eaten by the cow. The methane is emitted in burps, right? So it's not farts. Right?
Yep.
It's right. It's
opposite end.
Emitted. Yeah. And it's not even the cow that's producing that. It's actually an organism that sort of hijacked itself, and it lives in the rumen of the cow. And so it helps to break down, these really cellulosic grasses, and then produce methane that exits the cow. But you can see how the cycle works. It goes back into the atmosphere and then is converted into water vapor and carbon. And then the grass uses the carbon in the water to grow again. Yep. And so you see a harmonious system in that. Whereas taking carbon, deep carbon that we've essentially pulled out of the earth from deep sources, and then putting that into the atmosphere, that lasts for on average about 1,000 years.
Yep.
And so you have something that's between 28 and 33% more, in terms of heat trapping, which is methane. But then that carbon's just going to be there for so much longer, And so, I think, for us, what we wanted to do with the film was approach all of these subjects and just give people enough information to feel like they could act upon that, and to feel like they could get some understanding of what the argument is. Yep. Drive them to the book, which goes a lot deeper into a lot of the science that's involved in that. But then also get people to understand that everything has an effect. Everything that we do has an effect on the climate. So concrete production actually has more greenhouse gas emissions than animal agriculture. Rice farming is a huge emitter of methane for some of the same reasons. Peat bogs, all of these different sources. Every single one of them have been around for tens of millions of years. They're part of a natural cycle. We are the ones who have disrupted that in totality. We have disrupted it in so many different ways. And now we say to people, well, you can't eat meat because of all of the sins of the past, And I think that one of the things that I find kind of interesting about that is the argument that now we've started to say that, well, cows can actually store carbon because of the way that they eat grasses. So cow comes over the pasture, he chomps on the grass. You force him to move like they used to move in like herds, so that they're not always eating from the same grasses. Yep. That stimulates root growth in the grass. That root growth, carbon is needed, water is needed. It holds water. And produces all of this essential humus that we call soil, produces all of these different things, and can also sequester carbon. So, a lot of these scientists started to come out and say, hey, this is actually really interesting. We can sequester all of these damages that we've done to the environment by putting animals back onto pasture, specifically ruminants. And then a lot of the vegan activists said, well, wait a second, the science isn't particularly clear on this. This is, if there's a drought, you're going to lose that carbon anyway, whatever it is. But the cow has nothing to do with these arguments, right? The cow he's not supposed to pay for our sins either, right? And so to me, it reaches a sort of level of absurdity, because I don't necessarily know what to do with this idea that we need to, what we need to do is put animals back on pasture, because they produce nitrogen. We use their bones and their manure to fertilize the soil. It's all part of the cyclical cycle. It's what they were designed to do. So in theory, it's a harmonious and beautiful life for them. And at the end of the day, because we're driven by markets and everything like that, we eat the meat. And then we have to look at the nutritional components that are in meat. That calorie for calorie is just so dense, and when I look at this, it's like you look at the largest nutritional deficiency in the world, and it's iron deficiency.
Yeah.
And, it primarily affects maternal mothers, women, and children. And it has these, net effects on every aspect of it. It's like productivity, education, work days, all of these different things. If you are iron deficient, you are tired, you have poor muscle stimulation, you have all of these knockdown effects. And what ends up happening, it's even prevalent in Western countries, primarily with women who have been fed this sort of marketing ideas that they should abstain from red meat specifically for their own health and for the health of the environment. And so now they're also having these knock-on effects. Mm-hmm. And the long-term, I think, effects of that is like you see your mother deteriorating. You see, cognitive function in people who, you wouldn't normally see that over long periods of time, but you start to see these like knock-on health effects, multi-generational. And I noticed this a lot within the communities I was working with, like poorer communities, because you saw a lot of amputations due to diabetes. You saw a lot of lost work days. You saw a lot of chronic sickness and chronic illness and all of these different things. And when I was working at the nonprofit, which I founded, we were dealing with these things all the time. Yeah. And what we were doing was we were looking at the plates of what people are eating, and we saw all of this processed food and meat. And so my whole nonprofit was vegetarian, because I was like, what if we filled the meat with the meat and filled the rest with like fresh vegetables and fruits and all of this stuff. And what I started to see was the removal of meat. I started to see, coming from academia and all this other stuff, coming from, because most of our volunteers were nutrition students. And so they were all vegetarian. And so they were saying that the meat was the problem. And I started to get really worried about that. And that's how I ended up hooking up with Diana and working on this film.
Gotcha. Yeah, I was gonna ask you about that, just a little more on your background, how you kind of came to, being the producer of this film. So it was with that foundation that kind of led you in this direction.
Yeah, we were working primarily in New York City, in some of the lowest income neighborhoods in the country, lowest income congressional districts in the country. Mm-hmm. Working with charter schools who had the ability to functionally change the way that they fed their kids. And 60% of the meals are going to come from the DOE if you're, if your food is if you're a part of that program. And it can be really healthy. It can be really formative for these kids, for the students and stuff like that, or it can be junk food. Mm-hmm. And what we found was it was cost neutral to feed these kids non-processed food made in-house with fresh meat and vegetables. Yeah. It did not cost any more. And they could also feed the staff at the school within that cost neutrality as well. Wow. Right. And so we were seeing all of these effects that were happening on the kids. We were doing all of these family meals so the kids would sit down at these tables, these round tables, and they would serve each other, because what we saw was like the school to prison pipeline was like tray in hand to tray in hand to tray in hand. Yeah. We just wanted to disrupt that in so many different ways. And what we found was that the kids were never the barrier to change. The administration was never the barrier to change. But as you moved up and up the totem pole, people just stopped caring. They just didn't, they didn't think it was worth it, or they didn't see the effect that food would have on education, And so I get more and more frustrated with trying to make this argument. And I'd created the nonprofit with the notion that like, this is a solvable problem. Yeah. And so I would argue with my board of directors. I said, like, if we're doing this 10 years from now, like, I would have considered this a failure. This is actually solvable. Yeah. And so the more frustrated I got with it, the more I started to understand that there was a kind of a notion in America of like just to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, like everybody can make it here. And you know, I think you see the correlation between SAT scores and family income.
Mm-hmm.
You see all of these educational correlations that essentially the richer you are, the more wealthy you are, the more generational wealth you have, the more your children succeed, and all this other stuff. And I wanted to disrupt that idea.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have these cycles of poverty that kind of happen in America that are rooted in the system that I think is a mythology of, the lone genius, the, self-made billionaire, the self-made millionaire type of thing. And I wanted to disrupt that. So we started funding documentaries associated with that, social justice, environmentalism, and all of this other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that like Diana's perspective on this was approaching it in that general way. She wanted to talk about the nutritional aspects of it. She wanted to talk about environmentalism. Yeah. She wanted to talk about social justice. She wanted to talk about all these things. And she wanted to make a film for farmers. She didn't want to make a film for Hollywood, right?
Yep.
So there's no Joaquin Phoenix or anything like that. We were lucky enough to get Nick Offerman, who's, has been involved in agriculture for a really long time. Mm-hmm. Is involved in the craft movement, who understands a lot of these different things. And so we were lucky enough to get him,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just me being kind of in this area of focus the last, 5 to 10 years, seeing people like Robb Wolf and Dr. Mark Hyman was Chris Kresser was awesome, because I've been following all of them for quite some time, and looked up to them as really credible sources of knowledge and information. And just the fact that you guys were able to put all of those different topics, which are all interrelated, into a 90-minute film, I thought was so powerful and amazing. And then being able to back everything up by like solid science and research, which you can find more in the book, obviously. It was just I thought it was well put together with some great folks too in there.
Yeah.
You had the Polyface Farms. Joel was in there, and it was awesome. It's a good film.
Yeah. I mean, we had so many people who weren't able to make it into the film that we've released on the website as well. Interviews with Andrew Smith, who was a vegan for I don't know, close to maybe 20 years, or between a decade and 20 years. And he had written a treatise on veganism, trying to make the argument for it. And the more he delved into the moralistic, the science, and all of those different things, the more he sort of convinced himself out of it.
Yep.
I always thought that was really interesting. We John Eichert, who is in the film, in many ways, like Diana and I both teared up, like in that interview. The whole interview in and of itself is a guy who, I think in some ways the agricultural movement was centered around the idea of feeding the surplus population on the planet. I mean, we saw this exponential growth, in the 20th century, millions upon millions, now billions of people, every 20 or 30 years. How do you feed that? It's been in some ways an absolute miracle that we've been able to continue this process. And so, these guys were trying to create enough protein, trying to create enough like nutrients to feed a growing surplus population. And John was, heavily involved in that. And he also realized, I think, later on in life that this was not a sustainable system. And he's been trying to sort of pay for those sins as well. But you really feel like he understands the totality of the argument.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, it was really a give credit to Diana and to Rob for being able to pull all of these different ideas, because you don't know what's going to trigger a response in somebody. Is it their own personal health? Is it the health of their children, their grandparents? Is it concern about the environment? Any number of different sources. What brings you into to understanding where your food comes from, and advocating for change.
Yeah, it's a good point. And when you beliefs are really hard to change once you wholeheartedly believe in something, right? And I study a lot of neuroscience, and a lot of my videos are about neuroscience and the mind, the brain, and we're learning more about that every day too. But just conditioning and beliefs, it is hard to change unless you have something that really catches your attention, to like you said, failing health, or something about the environment that catches your attention, or what it could be, anything, right? And so that's one of the challenges is you have people who are vegans, and they're wholeheartedly in believing their health's going to improve, the planet would be better if we grew more plants and didn't harvest animals. And so that's a challenge in itself, just to get someone's attention, to intrigue them enough just to maybe consider a different opinion or a different perspective.
Yeah. I follow a lot of internal marketing that come, specifically designed around new product development and foods.
Mm-hmm.
And you really start to see a push nowadays to equate a lot of the social justice, environmental action, protests, and all of that stuff to plant-based meat.
Yeah.
And you see the wording manipulated by these Madison Avenue ad agencies and stuff like that. People really concerned about climate change, and now being marketed, a product that has all of these knock-on benefits, right? It's like, it's pure, it comes from nothing.
Yeah.
It's like this, that, whatever. It also costs more than meat, which is really strange, because I think if you looked at these commodity products, it's the same thing as cereal. Cereal costs like 20 cents to make.
Yeah.
It's heavily subsidized junk, and still costs like $6 or $7. Why? Because marketing towards children costs money.
Yeah.
All of these health symbols, and I remember it was the American Heart Association had given for $50,000 they would certify your food as heart healthy, and so you had Trix and Fruit Loops and all of these things considered heart healthy because they were low in cholesterol and all of this stuff. All of that costs money. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. They're spending billions of dollars to market that stuff. Imagine what they could do with that money if everybody was kind of on the same page, right? I mean, holy heck, it could be a completely different world, right?
Yeah.
So for people who maybe they're just hearing all this for the first time and their mind's kind of blown. They're like, wow, what am I hearing? I don't know what to think or what to believe. And I know even for me, even after I started to change my health and I had a good grasp on the diet perspective, just understanding, agriculture and sustainability, and, what's the difference between a regenerative farm versus a factory farm. That was all kind of confusing at first. I'm like, what is this all about? Right. And you have grass fed and grain fed. What's the difference between that? And should you eat one over the other? Is it too expensive? Is it not? What's kind of some of your thoughts on that? Maybe for somebody who's listening to that, maybe is there a way we could summarize what the difference is between regenerative agriculture and what is a factory farm? Why is it such a big deal? And it is kind of one of the underlying topics of this whole documentary. So what do you have to say?
I mean, it's a really good question. Regenerative is it's a word that I think is getting close to being co-opted by a lot of these different corporations. There are some really good people trying to do some good work in it. I think Patagonia, Timberland, there are a bunch of companies that are trying to work as sustainably as possible, or regenerative. So sustainable means, there's an interview in the film. He said, well, why would you want to sustain this? Right? This is, in order to produce the food that we produce nowadays, we have to strip mine, for phosphorus, for NPK fertilizers.
Mm-hmm.
So we take fossil fuels, we make that into ammonia, we add all of that stuff together into a fertilizer, and that's essentially, it's extractive. And, a lot of it runs off into waterways. In order to grow pretty much everything, you need nitrogen. And, you need these NPK, potassium, phosphorus, and nitrogen. Do you want to go deep into it or not?
Yeah, might as well. I mean, if you're good on time, then I got time.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So, all right. If you look at World War I and World War II within the landscape of food, as opposed to warring powers, colonization, and all this other stuff, if you look at it as repurpose the idea of the search for food, farmable landscapes, you can understand why Hitler made all of the decisions that he made. A lot of his speeches involved finding farmland for Germany, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so going into the 20th century, you have this, what we had was, we were really very quickly running out of renewable nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium. We had reached this point where we thought everybody in the world was going to start to starve. And what they had found was they had these. Sorry, this is going to get confusing, and then I'll make it make sense.
Yeah.
They had found all of these places in the world, a lot of them in South America, where these islands and atolls, and where bats and birds had shit for hundreds and thousands of years.
Yeah.
And that was an incredible amount of nitrogen. And so they created a new novel form of slavery where they took people, they essentially kidnap them and make them mine all of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And we're running out. And so there was this huge push. Where are we going to get all of the things that we need to grow all of our food? And so you start to see this real colonization movement of the Western powers, America and everything like that, to really start to pull all of these resources from the developing world, from places that hadn't been colonized before. So fast forward, you get somebody, Haber and Bosch are these two German scientists who are able to take nitrogen that exists in the air
Mm-hmm.
and make it into an active form of nitrogen. There's a tremendous amount of nitrogen in our atmosphere. They were able to synthesize that using fossil fuels. And lo and behold, they win the Nobel Prize. We're going to feed the world, all of that stuff. Turns out that is also incredibly good at making explosives. And so Haber and Bosch, Fritz Haber was also involved in creating the poison gases, the mustard gases that were used in World War I. He was a German Jew. His whole family had been killed in the Holocaust. He ended up escaping to France. His story is really tragic in many different ways. And it's one of the reasons why we don't know about him anymore. And so now you have these fossil fuel fertilizers, and we're starting to feed the world. We can extract all of these resources from Morocco and all of these different places. We combine them together, and suddenly we're feeding people.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're slowly starting to run out. We're slowly starting to, we've essentially created a landscape where we can continuously pump all of that stuff, but it's also creating dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
The plants don't take up as much nitrogen as they would, as we want them to. We've been really profligate with the fertilizers that we've thrown down. And so a lot of it runs off into our waterways, depletes the groundwater, all of these different things. We've been very extractive for the past 50 years in order to produce all of this food.
Yeah.
And so when we started to talk about sustainability, a lot of people started to push back on this. Well, what we need is actually regenerative. And regenerative means that you allow the natural cycles that happen that build topsoil, the stuff that we grow our food on. We allow those things to happen by mimicking what nature does.
Mm-hmm.
And a geologist will tell you it takes, tens of thousands of years to produce a few inches of topsoil.
Yeah.
And they're talking about glaciation. They're talking about like rocks moving and all of that other stuff. What we have found is that we can produce some of those same effects if we actually have a roundabout regenerative system that has animals on the land, brings in chickens, produces nitrogen, has dung beetles that break down the manure of cattle and anything that's in there, allows for ecosystems to function in the way that they have functioned for, since life existed on this planet. And so how do we mimic that and then also create a system that we can also still feed ourselves? And that's the general argument. One would say the impossible foods, the fake meat, all of that stuff is still heavily dependent upon that older system. Yep. It still uses a lot of pesticides and herbicides. It uses fossil fuel fertilizers. It still degrades the entire environment, kills everything on the land, also creates an ecosystem where nothing can live, which is always really interesting to me, because we talk about deaths in terms of ways to feed ourselves, but what if nothing can live on that land, right? Yep. What if you can't have, if you can't have bugs, you can't have birds, you can't have, all pollinators can't exist on those lands. They have to travel further and further in order to find things to pollinate, in order to feed themselves. Every single aspect of that world is essentially like, been governed by that system. And so, I just find it's like right now we're struggling in the same way the organic movement had struggled. Yeah. Was how do we define what regenerative is? Mm-hmm. And, I think the pushback from Black and Indigenous farmers who have been working regenerative for a long time, we need to start to talk with people who have over, decades and hundreds of years have been disenfranchised from systems that they actually understood. Native Americans farmed the entire Northeast, but we never recognized it as farmland, and they understand how to work this way holistically. And we need to get back to that and bring in everybody that we can, to talk about these things. Because I think it's the only way that we can really move forward. Yeah,
absolutely. And I don't know if there's any numbers or statistics behind this. Maybe it's in the book and I may have missed it, but do we have an understanding of maybe how many farms or farmers are moving in that direction, moving in the right direction? And do you happen to know that?
I think the promise and the hope that I have is the number of larger companies that I actually really feel care about the environment are getting on board with this.
Okay. And that'll influence downstream. Yeah.
Yeah. And the worry is that it gets co-opted and just turned into a marketing term or whatever. I do remember, I think cornflakes and Lucky Charms were arguing over who was more regenerative, So, I think when you reach that level of absurdity, sometimes it's hard to understand.
For sure.
Yeah. But it's, I don't know. I mean, look, I was born and raised in urban environments. So I lived in Queens, New York. It's been a decade for me to get my mind wrapped around agriculture in general, and all of that stuff. I don't expect people to be able to really grasp all of those things. It took me so long. I went from veganism to then understanding agriculture, then moving towards paleo and all of that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and if you have time, if you don't mind, I'd love to learn a little more about your background as far as kind of some of the health transformation you've gone through, and you mentioned veganism and kind of going from there. What was what's your story and how you got to where you are?
Yeah, I mean, I never, I grew up, my parents, I had a mother at home, so she cooked, she lived very low fat, powdered milk, margarine, all of those different things. I had weight issues all the way until I was probably in my 30s. Never really had like a proper understanding of nutrition. My friends used to joke, like, if I could eat a pill, that would deal with all of my caloric needs. And, you know, I got really involved in, I had two advantages. One was I worked in a butcher shop when I was 14. So I didn't have a weird relationship with meat. A lot of the nutrition students that I taught would like hold meat like, as if it was you know, poison. I found, I got really into cooking. I went to the French Culinary Institute. I studied there. I studied a lot of sort of, you know, my foray into that was living in England and also study French cooking. Nice. And so I studied a lot of their cultural heritage in terms of food. I think England has an absolutely stunning culinary history, regardless of what people say. You know, I think black pudding and, you know, they used all parts of the animal and all of that stuff. I learned a lot. I studied under a master butcher when I was in England. And then, you know, for me, that was my foray into it, was just mainly cooking. And then I found it completely transformative. Brain fog went away. I wouldn't say I struggled reading growing up, but I typically read between 2 and 3 books a week now. Nice. I do one Audible book. You know, before COVID, it was a little bit more. My average was really high. You know, I found my just attention and my recall to be much higher on a meat-based diet. You know, supplemented with vegetables. I found that getting rid of all vegetable oils was really transformative to me. You know, and then the rest for me, like I do a lot of I say lifestyle changes. So I do a little bit less in the gym now than I used to, but I spend a lot of time in squats. I spend a lot of time working where I'm not in, you know, we have essentially 3 positions that we live in. We stand up, we sit down, and we lie down. You know, and for the most part, like every part of our life goes from the crib, which is a box, you know, and I'm stealing this from my best friend, who's the trainer, into the cubicle, which is a box, you know, and then into the coffin, which is a box. So we have to break that, you know. So I spend a lot of time. I answer emails and squats. I'm constantly moving. I find, you know, I'm barefoot a lot. I like cold exposure. I also spend a lot of time in nature. All of those things are there for my mental well-being and health. But yeah, I never really had to, like, you know, some of the people I find are really quite amazing are people who like Diana, who grew up with undiagnosed celiac, who had, you know, every single aspect of her life changed when she removed gluten from her diet. You know, I don't have that generally, but you know, optimizing is also like fun as well.
Right?
Yeah,
absolutely, definitely. Oh, thanks for sharing that. I think so many people can relate with that who've gone on that journey. I know me as well. A lot of the things you mentioned that have improved, it was the same for me, and you know, a lot of my friends and family who've, you know, done the same thing. So, but there's a lot of people struggling that just don't, you know where to start, and don't even realize their food has to do with maybe a lot of the problems that they're seeing or feeling. And like you even mentioned, just, you know, being more active is huge, right? And how you treat your body and how you sleep and how you think. I mean, it's all really connected, and you really can't have one without the other. And so, absolutely.
And, you know, like if I was going to give one other piece of advice, novel movement is what our bodies were designed for. And so if you look at persistence hunters and all of that stuff, the way that they move across a landscape is very, very different from the way that we move nowadays. And if you I remember reading John Rady's book. He talks about the brain produces new brain cells all the time. It seems to only really connect into the network when you're using novel movement. And so creating physical education programs in schools that utilize that. I do a lot of like indoor rock climbing, things that require, I play tennis, they require strategy. They require movement in a way that's constantly changing. To me, like hell is paved with treadmills.
Yeah.
I just don't understand why people do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Stuff like that. Yeah. I mean, I think if you are, also moving through a landscape and in hunting, if you're doing that, slowly, with deliberation and really hyper-focused on what's around you, all of those things are just so amazing for the creative mind.
Yeah, for sure. It really stimulates the brain to have that novel movement and even a difference in temperature, like you said, with the cold exposure. I just put out a video a couple days ago. I went out for a hike in the woods and, I went shirtless and I did a quick video before I got shirtless to talk about, the different proprioceptive, and differences in the environment. And I even mentioned about, make your own trail. Like there's hiking trails, but I like to go off on my own and just kind of go rogue into the woods, like kind of paving my own way. But it's like that novel movement. The cold temperature, it's invigorating. It feels good. It relieves stress and it's good for you. So.
Yeah. And brachiate, right? So just hang.
Yeah.
God, it feels so amazing. Take some pressure off of that. I think one of the only gym equipment things that I have now is Olympic rings.
Nice.
I very rarely use anything else other than body weight and Olympic rings.
Yeah. I've never done anything with Olympic rings. I'd like to at some point. My gym actually has them. I train in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu mostly. That's what I do.
Oh, cool.
Which is awesome. I love it. It's a meditative experience. It's very physical. It's very proprioceptive. I mean, every movement is different and different angles and everything. But they do some like CrossFit style classes too. They have the Olympic rings in there, but I don't know what I'm doing, so I haven't really touched them.
Yeah, I think your BJJ grip strength will go through the roof. The more you hang. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. I do go in and hang from the bars sometimes.
Cool.
Just for a minute and a half, 2 minutes. I'll do that sometimes. I know it's great for the shoulders and everything. And I used to have shoulder issues when I first got into BJJ, and I had to work through that. And a lot of it was just, muscle imbalances and stuff like that. But I know hanging just is really invigorating for the shoulders. So I do that occasionally. But have to try the rings out.
Yeah, totally.
So, I know we're over time here, and I'm sure we could just keep going on and on, right? There's like so many topics, and this has been an awesome conversation. So again, I appreciate you taking some time out of your schedule to talk with me. And, if people wanted to learn more about you or Sacred Cow or, what's all the, the websites and links and ways.
Yeah. Sacred Cow is just came out on iTunes. Diana's website is probably the best compendium we have of all the information, the research that Rob and her have done. That is a Sustainable Dish, or you can just Google Sacred Cow documentary. It'll lead directly to that. My Instagram is Primate Kitchen. It's the opposite of Instagram. So I refuse to do reels or anything like that. But I think if you're looking at it and you follow it over a long enough period of time, you start to see where my mind is going with all of these disparate elements, from talking about agriculture to hunter-gatherers and ancestral diets and, people saying, any number of different aspects of the way that we our food and farming system work. I have to do better at like bringing it around to other people so that they can understand what my audience is like, you know, I don't know. The people who also interact on my page are stunning, absolutely amazing, really passionate about this subject. You know, not just for the health reasons, but for every aspect of it, which is kind of great. Awesome. Yeah, I mean that's about it. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. I'll put links of everything in the show notes, and we'll go from there. We'll have to do this again sometime, and maybe I can get you out to Western Pennsylvania and we'll do a little hunting, and you could show me some of your cooking skills, and we'll do a whole food from woods to table or something like that.
Oh man, that'd be great. Yeah, let's do it.
Absolutely, sounds good.
Cool.
So, all right.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, James, and have a good rest of the week.